Hey guys, it's me again, back with another video. This is for our class on Tuesday, March 31st, about science fiction and Octavia Butler's story, Speech Sounds. So before we get going today, I'm back at home, so my dad won't walk in the video, but my husband is making weird faces at me. So we'll see. We'll do our best to get through this one. I'm really excited about today to talk about Octavia Butler. I love Octavia Butler. I hope that you guys enjoyed the story, even though it was really poorly timed. I love teaching this story. I teach it every time that I teach intro, and I never thought that I would teach this story during an actual pandemic. So hopefully you were still able to enjoy it, and it didn't cause too much stress, at least, well, yeah. But so we'll talk about that today. And before we get going, I want to just look at kind of a benchmark where we are in the course before we get started. So let's take a look at the syllabus here for a second. We are starting our last unit today, which is exciting. We're talking about modes. So here we are. You're turning in your critique for Sydney's story by 11:59 tonight, Tuesday, March 31st, and you're going to respond to the questions that I'm asking you about the Butler story. And then so for homework, I'm going to post another video about the Machado story. We're talking about horror on Thursday, and then you'll read Shannon's story and do the critique. So that's all you're doing this week. Next week is the same. I'll kind of talk you through these two little stories for our video on Thursday. They're real short stories, but they're fantastic. So we'll talk about magical realism next week, and then we'll talk about fantasy. And this is our last published story that we'll read for the class. And then we'll kind of move into finishing up workshop, doing our final craft reflection on this last unit, and then talking about the revision, the final revision for our class. So that is what's going on for these next couple weeks. All you need to worry about this week is those critiques and doing the responses, okay? That's this week and next week. So that is where we are with this last unit. So let's get started. Today we are talking about the Butler story. We're talking about science fiction, and I'm going to pull up my little PowerPoint here, which doesn't really have anything going on for it. But here's a picture of Octavia Butler. She died recently in like 2006, but she's a really famous science fiction, speculative fiction writer. And before we get going talking about her story, I want to briefly define what I mean by science fiction and speculative fiction. So this is a book called How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy by Orson Scott Card. He wrote Ender's Game. And he says, here's a good, simple, accurate rule of thumb. If the story is set in a universe that follows the same rules as ours, it's science fiction. If it's set in a universe that doesn't follow our rules, it's fantasy. In other words, science fiction is about what could be but isn't. Fantasy is about what couldn't be. So here he's defining science fiction and speculative fiction as stories that loosely follow the rules of our world, the physical laws of our world, and fantasy sort of redefines the physical laws of the world. So that's what I mean by science fiction and fantasy. And as we go through these different as we go through these different modes, my assumption is that we've learned about all these little building blocks of fiction. We've talked about dialogue, talked about character, invention, setting, exposition, and now as we look at these different modes, we're going to look at how each little element of fiction is manipulated to produce these different genres and modes. Because, and here's my assumption, each mode has its own rhetoric, has its own traditions that it needs to follow in order to be a science fiction story, in order to be a fantasy story or a horror story. And so what I'm doing in this unit over the next 2 weeks is just giving a really introductory look at how these little elements of fiction are traditionally manipulated in order to follow the rhetorics of the genre. So let's get started with Octavia Butler's story today. And what I'd like you to do as you're going through these videos the next 2 weeks is make a little chart for yourself. And I've made one here that you can kind of look at and see. But it's going to allow you, if you sort of follow along with this chart, it's going to allow you to compare how these different elements of fiction are used differently according to the tradition that they're following. So the contrast will become apparent as we read more stories, but today we're just starting off with this Butler story. So if you are, following along, you might want to get out your notebook and make a similar chart as we talk through these different things. So we'll start off with characterization. And if we were together, I would ask you to describe how our characters here are characterized. So we've got Rye and we've got Obsidian. And if I were Dora the Explorer, I would give you a moment to think about how they're characterized. But for now, let's just say that they're round characters, right? We've talked about flat and round characters, and how flat characters are more archetypal, how they're not given really complex desires and fears. But here we have characters who are very real, right? They're considered round characters. And this is going to become important as we move on through the modes. But what's important now is that we realize that they're round. They're meant to be realistic. They're given histories, they're given fears and desires, and they're not really meant to stand in for any sort of archetype at the moment. So we've got realistic, round characters. Right, we get the history of Rye, who has her children who have passed away. We know what she wants, right? She wants company. And at first she thinks that she's going to get it in the form of Obsidian, who sadly passes away. And then in the end, she gets it in the form of these children who are able to speak like her. So that sort of sets up the narrative arc for the piece is the characterization. Another thing I want to focus on as we talk about mode and genre is plot. So what drives the plot? What's moving the story forward? What's the narrative engine of the story? And in science fiction and speculative fiction often, it's the invention that's moving the story forward, okay? So here the invention is the illness, right? That sort of takes away the literacy of the characters, the ability to talk. And so when we think about what keeps you going in a science fiction story, you're thinking about this sort of what if question, right? That's generated by the invention. So what if there was this illness that strips people of their ability to communicate? So you've got a what if driven but what's really important about the plot here, and if we move down to invention, is the fact that the invention meshes so well with the main character's characterization. So we have a character who we learn used to teach history at UCLA, right? We have a character with a room full of books that she's not able to read anymore, but she's not able to burn either. She's not able to get rid of. So we have a character who really values reading and literacy, and that's just taken away from her. So the invention is also in part character driven, right? I just watched, this isn't an invention, but I just watched the first Indiana Jones movie, and Indiana Jones is afraid of snakes, right? And then the lost ark that he has to find is in a pit with snakes. So what's important about this plot-driven story, which is propelled by the invention of the illness, is that the plot meshes with the character. So the invention in this case is the illness, but often in science fiction it's some sort of technology. So if you think back to Semplica Girl Diaries, we've got those Semplica girls hanging on the wire. But in science fiction, it's, technology or whatever, apocalypse, illness. But what's important about the invention is that it meshes with character. Okay, and then talking about exposition and the way that exposition is delivered. So this is going to become really important as we move along throughout these modes. But if you think about the way that exposition works in science fiction and fantasy, if we look through here, I guess I would ask you, if we were in class, like, how did you figure out what was going on with this story? When did you figure out what had happened to the world? And what is the importance of exposition in science fiction? Do we need it? And my answer might be that science fiction demands exposition. When we read a science fiction story, we must know what happened to the world. We must know the rules of the world. And so science fiction inherently asks for that explanation. So if we're completing our chart here, we might say science fiction demands exposition. And of course, we have writers who will break this rule. But this is kind of the tradition of exposition within the science fiction genre. The way that Butler handles it here is pretty interesting. We don't get a bunch of background right off the bat with this story. Our first kind of little blurb of exposition is on page 5. We see them gesturing, we see the actions, but we don't really get an explanation of what's going on in the world until this little this little paragraph, right? This illness, if it was an illness, had cut even the living off from one another. As it swept over the country, people hardly had time to lay blame on the Soviets, though they were falling silent along with the rest of the world. So what's interesting about this delivery of exposition, this withholding of exposition until almost a fourth of the way through the story, is that we're more invested in Rye and her character than we are in the conflict of what happened to the world. It's almost as though this conflict is secondary, and where our investment is meant to be in this story is with Rye and the way that she's moving through the world and she's coping with her current situation. So we have exposition, which is given in line with the tradition of science fiction, but it's given in a way which encourages reader investment with character. So as we move on and look at, we're talking about horror on Thursday, I want you to be thinking about how the techniques or the elements of fiction in the horror story from Machado, which is a kind of a gross, interesting story, compare to these sorts of these traditions of science fiction. And in the questions that I'm going to ask you to respond to, I'm going to ask you to engage a little bit more deeply with the techniques going on here. I might ask you a little bit more about what's going on with the exposition of the story and the characterization in the story. And again, you're just going to choose one and email that response to me by 11:59 on Tuesday night. So that is what's going on with this story. Before I kind of close out, I want to read to you a little excerpt from the introduction to a novel called The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. She's referred to as like the queen of science fiction. And so the introduction to her novel talks about what science fiction does. And I think that it's relevant to us, it's relevant to this story. So I'm just going to read like a page of it, and I think it might help inform your responses to the questions that I'm going to ask. And I think that I'll reference this in at least one of the questions. So I'm going to start here. She says, this book is not extrapolative. So she's saying she's not predicting the future when she says it's not extrapolative. If you like, you can read it and a lot of other science fiction as a thought experiment. Let's say, says Mary Shelley, that a young doctor creates a human being in his laboratory. Let's say, says Philip K. Dick, that the Allies lost the Second World War. Let's say this or that is such and so, and see what happens. In a story so conceived, the moral complexity proper to the modern novel need not be sacrificed, nor is there any built-in dead end. Thought and intuition can move freely within the bounds set only by the terms of the experiment, which may be very large indeed. So she's saying science fiction is a thought experiment, right? It's driven by that what if question. She says the purpose of a thought experiment, as the term was used by Schrödinger and other physicists, is not to produce the future. Indeed, Schrödinger's cat, Schrödinger's most famous thought experiment, goes to show that the future on the quantum level cannot be predicted, but to describe reality, the present world. Science fiction is not predictive, it is descriptive. Predictions are uttered by prophets free of charge, by clairvoyants who usually charge a fee and are therefore more honored in their day than prophets, and by futurologists salaried. Prediction is the business of prophets, clairvoyants, and futurologists. It is not the business of novelists. A novelist's business is lying. The Weather Bureau will tell you that what next Tuesday will be like, and the Rand Corporation will tell you what the 21st century will be like. This is obviously written in like the 80s. The 60s is when this was written. I don't recommend that you turn to writers of fiction for such information. It's none of their business. All they're trying to do is tell you what they're like and what you're like, what's going on, what the weather is now, today, this moment, the rain, the sunlight. Look. Open your eyes, listen, listen. That is what the novelists say. But they don't tell you what you will see and hear. All they can tell you is what they have seen and heard in their time in this world, a third of it spent in sleep and dreaming, another third of it spent telling lies. So I love this excerpt from Le Guin because she's talking about the way that science fiction tells us more about our present moment than it tells us about what the future will be like. And I think that this applies really well to this story from Octavia Butler, and especially her use of exposition, because we're learning more about Rye's desire for companionship and the way that she's sort of suffering or moving forward through her grief and the loss of her children than we really learn about like what the world might look like if it were laid to waste. And so I will ask you to kind of think about how the techniques in this story work to achieve what Le Guin is talking about in her little excerpt in your responses to me. So that is what's going on for your response. And then on Thursday, you'll be reading the Machado story and you'll be reading Shannon's story. All right? So that is all for now, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye.